I am
All
seeing
right.
something in the top corner. Oh no, now it's gone. You're good.
Okay, you ready to go?
Yep.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Actually, it's still morning here in Oregon. My name is Mary Ellen Dello Stritto, and I am the Assistant Director of the Research Unit at Oregon State University Ecampus. I'm really happy to be invited to present this afternoon. I'm going to be talking about disseminating research on online education best practices. Whoop. Hold on a second. There we go. So anyway, this is me, and if you're interested in our Twitter, you see that on the screen right now, and you can find me at oregonstate.edu specifically. I'm going to begin by talking a little bit about our OSU eCampus Research Unit, and then we'll get into the topic of the day. So the OSU eCampus Research Unit conducts award-winning research on online education, and our unit aims to support colleagues like you with actionable research in online education. Examples of this are on your screen right now. So for example, we have our award-winning online learning efficacy research database. We have 2 edited collections, one called High Impact Practices in Online Education, and one called The Business of Innovating Online. We also have a podcast called Research in Action, and we do our own national and local studies. And all of our research can be found at ecampus.oregonstate.edu/research. So I'm going to begin here today by asking a question. I thought I would start by just starting with this basic question. If we are going to be disseminating our research, I thought it would be good to start with this question of why. So why should you share your research in online education? If you could take a minute and in the chat, not the question and answer, but in the chat, go ahead and tell us what you think based on this question.
If people set their chat to all panelists and attendees, then everybody can see besides just the 2 of us.
Okay, and actually I don't see the chat right now. So that's a little strange. There we go, maybe I'll go to more. There it is. All right, so what are we getting? Great, provide examples of best practices and increasing research. To help others learn from your mistakes, that's a good one. Yeah, I agree, win-win all around, that's another good one. Right, learning from each other, also good. Get support. Best practices, good. All right, good answers, right? So I just thought it would be good for us to kind of start with that question of why. We're doing research to get information into the field, right? To better best practices, to expand. Okay. Any other thoughts? Oh, I have a question here. Can we repeat the URL? So our basic URL is ecampus.oregonstate.edu/research, and that will take you to our main page. I can put that here in the chat. Okay, great. So that was our first question. So here's the next question. Again, go ahead and put some answers in the chat. What are methods of research dissemination that you are aware of? So what methods of research dissemination are you aware of? Okay, publish articles, very good. Scholarly journals, yep. Webinars, I see, blogs, conferences like this, good. Publications, QM resource site, very good. articles, books, print, online, informal discussions, Mendeley, Open Scholar. These are very good. Websites, reports, very good. All right, well, that will get you thinking about kind of dissemination. And what we're going to talk about today is what are the things you need to be considering, right? So based on what you've all put in the chat, I think we've covered most of these, but here's some examples. Traditional print is what we're typically used to seeing, right? So many of you talked about journal articles, books, those kinds of things. Conference session like today, webinar, also a good one. Social media engagement, I don't know if we had any of that in our chat responses. Podcasting, as I mentioned earlier, we have a podcast, and that's one way that we try to disseminate other people's research. And blog posts. So those are some basic ones that you may be aware of specifically. Okay, so thanks for getting started with those thoughts. What I'm going to do next is just give you a basic overview of what we're going to talk about for the rest of our session. So we started with you thinking, which is why we have the little brain on the screen. And the next thing I'm going to talk about are big questions. So what are the big questions that you need to ask when you are planning to disseminate research? Then I'm going to go through a kind of thought experiment in terms of what we would do to create a dissemination plan. And I'm going to give you an example. I'm going to give you examples throughout, but I'm going to give you a specific research unit example toward the end. And then we'll talk about some reflections and some takeaways. And the basis of this presentation really is from our wonderful Ecampus marketing team. And they do a wonderful job of helping us at the research unit think about this, do this kind of dissemination planning, and then of course they help us execute it. So this is information that we're getting from our superb marketing team. So I have to give them kudos because we've learned a tremendous amount from them, and that's the basis of the information that I'm giving you today. So let's look at three big questions. So when you're planning on disseminating your research, what are the three things that you should be thinking about? So I think of these as kind of the top level questions. The first question being what? What do I want to share? The second question being who is my audience? And those two questions feed into this third question of what outlets will be used. So this is a framework to think about dissemination planning. Best practices in the field are that you spend about 80% of your time actually writing and about 20% dissemination planning. Our ratio in the research unit is probably a little bit higher. We spend a lot of time from the beginning of a project thinking about what we're going to do with the results. So we have learned, again, from our marketing folks how to kind of think about this and to be prepared as we go through the process of how we will be disseminating. And I'm going to give you an example today of a project that's going to be a long-term project. And so we're thinking about this in terms of long-term dissemination. We've already started our dissemination planning, but it's going to be an evolving process specifically. So now I'm going to zoom into each of these three kind of top level questions. The first question being, what do I want to share? And we'll go a little bit deeper in each of these. So there's the first question. What do I want to share, or what to share? So there are some sub questions here. And in dissemination planning, one of the first things you need to think about are the goals, right? So what are your goals for disseminating your research? Are you trying to reach a broad audience? Are you trying to get an executive summary into the hands of certain individuals? Are you trying to reach a specific audience? So setting out goals are always a good thing, right? And in dissemination planning, that really is the top level question that you should be grappling with. So what do I want to do with my dissemination? So for example, we had a study on instructional designers and the research experience of instructional designers. And in that study, when we were thinking about the dissemination plan, we were trying to figure out, who do we need to reach, and how are we going to reach them? And so that's linked into this question of goals. It's also linked into this next question, which is what is relevant to the field? So this area of understanding research, expertise, and interest among instructional designers was very relevant to the field, specifically to instructional designers who were the participants in our survey, but also administrators and program directors wanted to know what the interests were in the areas of research for this particular group of people. So in terms of the relevance, we were looking at, that question of audience, who is going to be most interested in these results. And that was a key factor in our planning and our dissemination in terms of what, right? So what are the key takeaways for those particular individuals? So key messages. Our key messages are often, what are the recommendations that came out of our particular research? That might be some of the key messages that we want to disseminate. And so we're thinking about those recommendations often, as soon as the study is done, and how are we going to disseminate those pieces? And then the last kind of sub-question here are, what are the data types? So we do mixed method studies. We do both qualitative and quantitative data analysis, and that is a consideration in terms of, what pieces are we going to share from a particular study? Are we going to share quantitative information? Are we going to share qualitative information? Are we going to share both? And we'll talk a little bit more about that in future questions. So those are some things to think about in terms of what to share. And as I mentioned, audience is always a big one. So let's move to the second large question. As I mentioned previously, the goals, right? The goals are often tied up in who is your audience. So here are some things to consider in terms of audience. So what is the broadest audience that you're trying to reach? And thinking about it broadly will help you think in terms of the outlets, which is our third question. What is the best way to reach your audience, right? So where are they likely to be? How are you likely to reach them? And then the third area here, what will your audience want to know about the project? So going back to that example of our instructional designer study about their research interests, our dissemination was actually planned through the organizations that we recruited participants from. For example, Quality Matters was one of the organizations that we partnered with to reach out to instructional designers to fill out our survey. And so therefore we did dissemination planning through all of those organizations that we recruited from. In some cases we did blog posts, in some cases we did webinars that followed up after the results of the study. And that was one way that we knew we were reaching the audiences that we actually drew from for participation. So all really key questions to think about is, who is your audience? And as I mentioned, that audience question will help us do some planning in terms of the audience and the outlet, some of those examples that you provided before. So let's look at that question. So how does the audience relate to the outlet? So I gave you the example of our instructional design study. Often your audience is tied to a specific outlet where they're going to be more likely to see those results. So if you are interested in reaching faculty, where are they likely to be finding research? In a journal, in a newsletter? What are they interested in? Also think about your audience in terms of whether you have an internal audience versus an external audience. And we're thinking about this a lot in our research unit, because sometimes we have studies that have both internal and external audiences. And in some cases, we just have an internal audience. So what is the best way for us to share our important information with leadership, provosts, presidents, etc.? Sometimes that might mean a bullet point set of talking points or a bullet point list of key findings. In some cases, if we're thinking about a broader audience, we're going to think about a webinar, an online publication, a report, a blog. If we're trying to get it very widely disseminated, we want anyone to be able to find it, of course, we're going to think about our website, which we, tend to always have strong presence of our studies on our website. So these are all things to think about, is that your audience may often dictate what outlets you're going to focus on for disseminating your research. So here's an example from our unit of audience versus outlet. We did a study that looked at student device preferences. And this study had several audiences that we considered. The students that we asked to answer the survey were interested in this. Institutional audiences, so audiences within our institution, but then other schools around the country were really interested in what our students had to say to see if it had any relevance to their population. So we saw this particular study as having both internal and external audiences. And so we disseminated this pretty broadly. We had a report that is available on our website. Then we had a landing page, as I mentioned. So you see the image here on the screen of the landing page that talked about the study and gave some key pieces of data to interest folks, and then you could download the study. And then on the right side, you see an example of one of our social media posts that we use to disseminate in social media. In this case, just the report and not necessarily a specific piece of data, but we also did that as well. So that's one example of how our audience has really directed our efforts in terms of outlets for dissemination. So I've already gone there, but let's go to that very third question, right, which is what outlets are we going to use? And so this is really a summary of what we've already talked about, things to consider in terms of what outlets are you going to use. And we probably should say what outlets plural, because you're probably going to have more than one if you're trying to do this well. So again, consider your audience, as we've already mentioned. But another point that we want to mention here is think about your data visualizations. As I mentioned earlier, you may have qualitative and quantitative data. How are you going to best convey those in ways that your audience can understand them? So we are always in our dissemination planning thinking about data visualizations. What's the most effective way to visualize kind of the key findings? How is it going to be accessible so that everyone can understand it? And that goes along with that last point, which is what visualizations can stand alone. When we are making decisions about graphs and charts and other visualizations, we often think about how are we going to use them on Twitter? How are we going to use them in a social media post? How are we going to use them potentially on our website? How are we going to use them in a PowerPoint presentation? And thinking about that can actually help direct us in terms of the types of visualizations that we use. So the question of can your figure or your data visualization stand alone without the context of your report? That's really important, for example, on Twitter or on LinkedIn. So these are the things that we think about in terms of considering our outlets and what goes along with that consideration of outlet. So let me show you this slide, which talks about what we call the life cycle of a publication. In the research unit, we consider the full life cycle of our studies and reports. And we think about this early and often, I guess, as we say. When designing our visuals, we consider how they're going to be used in multiple ways, as I mentioned before. So here's the example of our student device preferences report and how we used key pieces from that report on the landing page for that study. Then we also used the visualizations from the report in our presentations. We also used some of this material in our social media, as I said, in posters. And then this question here of evergreenability. So how are your visualizations going to withstand time? So if you want to share your publication or a particular piece of your publication in the future, can they stand alone? Will they be understood if you use them in your social media feed in a year? So those are all the considerations that we are thinking about when we are planning to disseminate for each of these studies. Okay, so the next thing that I want to talk about is how do you do this, right? So we looked at these three big questions. So now I'm going to walk you through the possibility of creating a research dissemination plan for yourself. So what do you need to think about? What are the steps? And these are 5 basic categories or steps, if you want to think of them that way, that our marketing team has given us in terms of a step-by-step process. So we begin, again, as I mentioned, pretty early in our research cycle to think about these things. So these 5 things are scope and context, right? So I will talk about each of these in turn. The second set is goals. The third set is audience. The fourth set is key messages. And then lastly, we'll talk about tactics. Okay, so I will go through each of these, and I'm going to give you an example from a study that we are currently actively doing dissemination planning right now. So let's start with the first one. So the first step in creating a research dissemination plan is to describe the scope or the context for promoting this research. And remember that question of relevance? Here's where we would ask that question, right? So why is it relevant? And hopefully we're all doing great research that is relevant. I'm sure we are. So in the research unit, we consider why are we promoting our research, that question of why. And let me give you an example, as I said, from a current project. So a project that we are in the middle of right now is our instructor study. And our instructor study began with a series of interviews with our long-term instructors here at Oregon State University. And these are instructors that have been teaching online for 10 years or more. And we began by doing a series of interviews with this group of long-term instructors. After that, we started doing interviews with shorter-term instructors, so 1 to 2 year, 3 to 9 year instructors and graduate students. And so this is a very large qualitative study, interview study. And so we are thinking about this as a very large long-term study, but we're also right now beginning to release some of the new information from that long-term group. So for example, last week, I gave a presentation with some preliminary results from those long-term instructors. So we are, actively beginning to disseminate, but we're also still in the planning stage. So this is 2 things happening here at once. And so we're thinking right now in terms of where is this relevant? Who's our audience? Who's going to want to know about these pieces? And that question of relevance and scope are really driving what we're thinking about doing. And so, for example, we're starting right now with some conference presentations and getting feedback in that way. So that's part of that first step, is thinking about scope and context. So the next step is goals. So the question here is, what are 3 or 4 goals for your dissemination plan, right? So goal setting is always a good thing because then you can help execute and meet those goals. So for example, in this instructor study that I've been telling you about, one goal right now, because this is a rather large several phase study, one of our goals is to just share the methodology and how we recruited, especially that first set of long-term instructors, and share the methodology of doing 3 one-hour interviews over a period of 6 months. So that piece right now has become central to what are we going to put on the website, our website, to describe this study at this particular point. Another goal is for us to share responses in contrast. And so one of the things we're planning is to compare the responses on a particular question, compare the responses from the 10-year plus group versus how the new online faculty answered that question. So that's an analysis plan, but also a dissemination plan. So these are the things that we're thinking about in terms of our goals. The third step then is to consider your audience. So who is your target audience? And you might even have a secondary audience. Who is that audience? Where are they? Again, going back to that question of how are we going to reach them? In our instructor study, we've considered several audiences. We think one audience for our instructor study, especially the long-term cohort, Our faculty who are just beginning teaching online are probably going to be really interested in hearing the experiences of folks who've been teaching for 10 years or more. So that's an audience. We also know instructional designers, administrators, program directors are very interested in these experiences and what these faculty are telling us. We have internal audience that are very excited about this study. So asking these questions of who and then where are they and how to reach them, that helps us figure out our tactics. So what are we going to do? And so that goes back to the outlet question that we've already talked about. As I already mentioned, we're doing research, or we're doing conference presentations right now, but we're also trying to figure out what articles we may want to publish from this several phase study. And we're also considering webinars and other outlets as well. So that's our third step. Our fourth step is our key messages. So again, I think we mentioned this earlier, I mentioned this earlier. What are 3 or 4 key messages that highlight your research? What are your talking points? What are the key things that you want people to know about your research? Now, in the marketing world, they call this the call to action. Like, what are the actions that people want to take? Or what are the actions that you want people to take based on the results that you have? So key messages are really important. So I already mentioned for our instructor study that we are developing our web presence for that study. So that's where some of our dissemination planning is happening. And we, at this point, have decided on 3 or 4 key points that we're going to put onto our website for the study. And since this is such a wide-ranging study, as I mentioned, right now, our key data points that we want to share are the number of interviewees, the number of hours of audio files. We have a lot of audio files from these interviews, and the number of pages of transcripts. And those are impressive numbers right now. So that is at least our preliminary way that we're going to share this kind of broad study that we've done before we get into the actual results of the study. So when we are planning our social media posts, our webinars, our conference presentations for the study, we're going to consider those key messages and then think about how to share those particular key messages. All right, now we're down to our last step in the plan, and that is tactics. And what are tactics? These are just the actionable items that you're going to do. This is your to-do list or your to-do items that you can check off, right? So what is our first step? So I mentioned before, one of our checklist items right now is to develop the web copy for our web page. Our marketing and web team are waiting for us to prepare this for them so that they can prepare a landing page for this study. Other kind of tactics that we're working on is we're still doing quite a bit of qualitative analysis, and we're coding these interviews data right now. And we're also thinking about what are the different projects that will come out of this, what are the publications that will come out of this based on all of the results that we have. So tactics is the last step. So that brings us back to the 5 steps again, so you can see the 5. So I hope that is useful to kind of hear how we are thinking about each of these pieces. But it is, again, as I mentioned, something that you may begin, but then you may go back to over time and reconsider. And if you have longer term projects, this dissemination plan may shift and change as well. So having kind of given you that example, let me ask another question as a form of reflection. And again, let's take a look, let's do this in the chat. So what are barriers to disseminating your research? So what are concerns or questions that you still have? Go ahead and put them in chat. So what are barriers to disseminating your research? Time. Yep, time to do the checklist of tactics. Yep, that's a good point. Time to do the planning, right? You've got to set time to do this. Time constraints, good. Any other barriers that you can think of? Good point. How do we drive folks to what we wish them to read? Yeah, that's a great point. So that may be where, you want to work with, marketing folks in your realm, see if they can help you with social media and things like that. Technology can be a barrier, certainly. Certainly, that's a barrier to think about. Confidence in your own abilities, okay? Yes, research review board approvals. Yes, that is definitely a barrier. You got to have it approved. Any other barriers? Some outlets are not very academically appealing as of yet, like blogs. Yeah, that's a very good point. That's a very good point. So thinking maybe about multiple outlets, doing some blog posts, doing some newsletter items, as well as maybe some more scholarly publication. Completing the manuscript. Yes, yes, good point. Well said. Okay, soft research versus hard research, and this question of value. Yeah, right. That's a great point. Good point. Things to consider. Any other barriers or things that you're thinking about? Knowing where to go for resources. Okay. Yeah, and so I'm not sure quite what that means in this case, but most of your campuses will have some marketing folks that could potentially help you with this process. The perfection factor. Okay. Not good enough yet, overanalyzing. Yeah, that's a very good point. Again, think about what are the basics that you could share, right? Even if it's methodological basics before you feel like you're ready to share your results. Good. Understand the audience for the research really well. Funding. Yeah, right. Can't solve all of those, but those are all very good barriers to think about. And what are the restrictions that funders may have? That may also be a point. Okay, your target audience may not be willing to try other things like webinars and such. Okay, that's a challenge. Institutional politics, that's a good one. Yeah. Yeah, so in some cases, maybe overcoming some of these barriers is, again, to think about multiple outlets. Think about the executive summary. Think about, key indicators and put them in different outlets. Good. All right, well, I'm going to just make a couple more comments and then we can move to some question and answers. Let's look at just some key takeaways that I want you to get from this. So a couple of key takeaways to kind of summarize what we have talked about here in particular. The first one being, think about your dissemination early in the project. So that's something that I think may in some cases be challenging for us. As we saw in your comments in the Q&A or in the chat, we're working on the analysis. How can we be thinking about dissemination? It's still a good idea when you're in an analysis phase to be thinking about who's going to be interested in this. How am I going to put this together? How am I going to write this up in a way that people can use the research that we've done? And that's, again, going back to that question of why. Second key takeaway is to focus on your dissemination goals. That goal setting is actually very, very useful, and keeping that in mind, going back to those goals and saying, where do I want to go with my dissemination, is really a useful way to kind of keep focused and keep on track. And then finally, I think we've said it several times here, of course, but consider your audience when planning those outlets. So those are the three things that I hope you can kind of take away and use, and think forward about how you're going to share your research. So now I think we can go to questions. Let me just go to one more slide here. So do we have questions? General questions about anything that I've talked about?
There are no questions in the Q&A.
No questions. Oh my goodness. Okay.
But people might put them in the chat in a second.
Okay, we'll take a watch. Any questions? They're thinking very hard about their questions right now.
Looks like one came in. Here's one from Robin. Do you see any trends in dissemination?
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm seeing trends, particularly in kind of the reports that we see, and I know a lot of you have seen, the big industry reports in online ed. And what I'm seeing is a lot more previews. I'm getting a lot of emails saying this report is coming out. This report will come out in a month. And I'm wondering I have to ask my marketing folks, if they know if these things are working. But what I'm seeing is a lot more, look for our report. Our report is coming. And maybe that is a technique to try to get people interested in a particular report and to actually get them to go and download a report. So that's one of the trends that I'm seeing. I think there's also, particularly in online ed, a lot of webinars happening. When new research comes out, folks are doing webinars. I'm seeing that kind of broad dissemination happening in social media and reports and webinars and conference presentations and all of those areas. So I think that's a great question. Thank you, Robin.
There's another one from Amar. Do you have a person who assists faculty with dissemination of research at your institution?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, at Oregon State, we typically have, colleges all have their own way of doing things. So we have kind of a distributed and kind of independent set of colleges. So I can't speak to what's happening at each of our colleges. But in terms of what the research unit does, I can, speak to the fact that, we fund a group of fellows every year, and we have them produce white papers every year. And so we publish those white papers based on their research on our website every year. So that's what we're doing. I can't speak to the rest of the university, though, so it's a good question.
Robin did put something in the chat. Where might an executive summary be acceptable? She likes that idea.
Yeah, what I'm finding is that those executive summaries are very useful, I've found, and we've found, as an internal dissemination tool. So leadership, deans, provosts, associate vice presidents, et cetera, they often want the executive summary, the 1 to 2 page. Here's what the study was, here's how we completed the study, and here are the key pieces that are relevant, because those individuals are looking at the research and saying, what can I do based on this? What are the recommendations based on this research? What are the key pieces that I can make actionable? So I think executive summaries can be useful internally, especially. Great. Thank you from Renee. Something else to consider is the 60-second elevator speech. How can you explain your study in 60 seconds when you run into someone who may be interested? Great idea. Thank you very much for bringing that up. That's really important as researchers, that we can, say in 60 seconds or less, here's what the heart of my research was about. Great point. Thank you. Yep, that's quick dissemination, as we would call it. And what we often do here at Oregon State for our leaders in Ecampus is that we give them talking points. Here was the study, and here were the key findings. And we give that to them, because then when they interact with folks, they can answer those questions. Great. Thank you. Any other questions? How are we doing on time?
You have
5
minutes left, yes.
Okay. Any other thoughts? So I can at least put up our Connect with Us slide. So again, here is our main site. You can get to us at ecampusoregonstate.edu/research, our eCampus Research Unit email, and our Twitter, and our podcast for your information. And all the studies that I presented today can be found on our website, except for the new one that I talked about that we're in the process of disseminating. Any other thoughts, questions? Okay, while you're still pondering, I have one more slide to share. And that is, I want to share with you an active application process that we have going on right now. We have something called our online teaching and learning research seminars program. And this is a collaborative research opportunity. And this year we are bringing together a group of researchers from across the country to do some work using the technique of meta-analysis. And some of you may be familiar with that. That's a technique, a statistical technique to combine studies. And so we're looking for folks to apply to be a part of this seminar program. The seminar program runs for 3 summers, and you are funded to come to Corvallis and work on these projects with a group of people from around the country. So if that is something that interests you, go ahead and copy the link on the bottom of the slide there, ecampus.oregonstate.edu/seminars. And you may reach out to me if you're interested. I can answer specific questions on that program. All right, do we have other questions or thoughts?
You were getting some kudos in,
Okay,
but
very
no
good.
more, I've not seen any more questions. So I guess at this point, I will say thank you very much, Marion, for the presentation. If you members of the audience are staying here for Kay and Will's presentation, you can sit tight to the top of the hour. Otherwise, if you are going to Whitney's talk on practical methods for designing research studies, I can give you that URL. Sometimes you have to actually log out of this room and log out of Zoom and then come back into the other Zoom room. But there will be a presentation here on coming up in 8 minutes on online instructor competencies, motivations, attitudes, and values, what the research literature tells us. So at this moment, I will stop the recording.